The South African History of ANC and MK in Exile, Part 2. The conduit of ANC and MK to exile and a refugee hub. Despite its location between hostile neighbors ruled by white minority regimes, which acted as a buffer for South Africa against a rising tide of Black nationalism, Botswana became a preferred point of departure for African National Congress ANC and uMkhonto weSizwe MK cadres heading to Europe, Tanzania and later Zambia. Botswana functioned as a conduit for operations in South Africa rather than being a site for liberation movements to set up training facilities. The Botswana route for the ANC was established within the efforts of Fish Keitsing, a citizen of Botswana who left his country to work in South Africa. He later joined the African Mineworkers Union, AMU, and the ANC in 1949, becoming a branch leader for the Newclare Branch. Subsequently, he was arrested and charged with treason in 1956 Treason Trial. As a result, he was deported back to Botswana and asked by Walter Sisulu to set up safe houses in the Lobatse area. Between 1960 and 1962, he worked closely with Joe Modise in facilitating the movement of people through Botswana and relaying ANC messages to and from South Africa. With increased repression inside South Africa in 1960, the ANC resolved that Oliver Tambo and Yusuf Dadoo should leave their country. They passed through Botswana and their brief presence in the country worried the colonial government. For security reasons, they were moved from Lobatse to Serowe, where they were hosted by Lenyeletse Seretse, a cousin of Chief Seretse Kama. After a launch of MK in 1961, Keitsing received a number of people who left the country for military training. In January 1962, Nelson Mandela crossed the border into BACHUANALAND and spent a night at Keitsing House when his flights to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania was cancelled. Keitsing was joined in his work by Dan Tlume, an ANC member who fled to Botswana in 1963. Another figure connected with the ANC's early contact in Botswana was Jonas Dinoe Matlou. He was sent to formally establish an ANC office in Botswana and to work underground in setting up a transit point for ANC members leaving the country for military training. Matlou also worked with other African countries, establishing relationships on behalf of the ANC. Apart from South Africans fleeing political persecution by the apartheid government, there were citizens of Botswana who were sympathetic to the cause. For instance, Mike Dingake, Klaas Motsididi, Mark Mosepele, and Mpo Motsamai played important roles in assisting recruits to move through Botswana on their way to Tanzania and later to Zambia. Neil Parsons points out that the pipeline, a route that took South African refugees northwards across the Zambezi, was initially protected from local police interference, probably by Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. The government of MK recruits from South Africa into Botswana was also facilitated in part by members of Hurute community who had fled to Botswana in the late 1950s. They experienced political persecution by the South African government after refusing to carry passes. For MK recruits leaving through Botswana for military training, there were mainly three ways to leave. One was using a chartered aircraft which flew out of the country to Tanzania or some other African country and then proceed to Europe. For instance, when Nelson Mandela left South Africa to mobilize support for the armed struggle and military training, he boarded an aircraft which airlifted him from Botswana to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Billy Modise, who was to board a chartered flight from Botswana to Accra, missed his flight and had to travel by road through Zambia to Tanzania. Similarly, upon their return, the planes landed in Botswana, and those tasked with infiltrating people back into South Africa would facilitate their safe passage. Another route which several MK recruits under the Exit Botswana from Tanzania was through South Africa, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, into northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and onto Tanzania. The journey was made into cooperation with members of the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, a liberation movement fighting against white minority rule in southern Rhodesia. ZIPRA helped MK cadres to cross into northern Rhodesia, from where they found their way into Tanzania. The same process was repeated in reverse where trained cadres were returning to South Africa. Thirdly, Kazungula became increasingly important to MK recruits leaving or returning to South Africa. Kazungula lay at the confluence of Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and the Caprivi Strip of Namibia. It was possible to cross the Zambezi River directly from Botswana into Zambia by boat. A ferry service which carried about 25 people at a time, operated by Nelson Maiblowa, a Zimbabwean national, became an important link for MK in Zambia. Not surprisingly, the ferry was named the Freedom Ferry. From June 1962, MK guerrillas heading to Tanzania began using this route. For instance, Urea Maleka and Theophilus Ranka Olo took the Freedom Ferry from Zambia to Botswana as they attempted to make their way back to South Africa. However, there were some limitations when the ANC attempted to infiltrate guerrillas back to South Africa, as the move put the Botswana government in a different position. Botswana's response to MK activities. Pressure applied by South Africa forced Botswana to take action, or at least to be seen to be taking action, against the use of its territory as a transit point by MK guerrillas. Botswana also had to behave in a manner that would not be viewed as detrimental to the struggle in South Africa. In 1967, the MK launched the Wanki campaign to establish communication bridges in South Africa and MK headquarters outside South Africa. A detachment, which Chris Hani and Commissar attempted to cross Rhodesia to reach South Africa. After at least 2 successful raids on Rhodesia and South Africa forces, the detachment was finally forced to retreat. On their retreat to Zambia, they attempted to cross to Zambia via Botswana, where they were promptly arrested and taken to Francistown for interrogation. The arrest of this detachment was a result of pressure on the government of Botswana from South Africa, Rhodesia, and the British government. The Botswana paramilitary unit that arrested the group was under the command of a British commander. The government of Botswana took these measures to avoid reprisals from the 2 governments. President Sir Seretse Khama said, "As a consequence of Botswana's geographical situation, we face unusual and onerous handicaps, whilst Botswana accepts that we are part of the Southern African economy, complex, and that the harsh fact of history and geography cannot be obliterated. For obvious reasons, we have to maintain normal friendly relations with South Africa, Neerman 1993. Says President Sir Seretse Khama. After a week, Hani's group was charged with entering Botswana illegally, with importing and being in possession of arms. Hani was sentenced to 6 years in jail, while other members received prison terms ranging from 3 to 9 years. The imprisonment of MK fighters in Botswana led to an uneasy relationship between the Organization of African Unity, OAU, and Botswana. The latter demanded assurances from the former that its territory would not be used as a springboard by guerrillas going into South Africa. In March 1968, the OAU sent 5 of its representatives to Botswana to talk to the imprisoned guerrillas and compile a report. The committee recommended that the OAU Council of Ministers should appeal to the government of Botswana to release the guerrillas. With mounting pressure from the anti-apartheid movement and the OAU, the guerrillas were released and deported to Zambia. After 1969, a more assertive Botswana offered more open moral support for liberation movements. However, the position of Botswana remained precarious. While it supported the liberation struggle by providing refuge for political activists, it refused to allow its territory to be used as a base for military training for all the liberation movements. Botswana maintained its policy of prohibiting the ANC or any other liberation movement from launching military operation against South Africa from its territory. With the explosion of student unrest inside South Africa in the June 1976 and the heavy-handed response by the government, hundreds and later thousands of students were into exile in Botswana, while some left the country and proceeded to join liberation movements such as the African National Congress ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress PAC in Tanzania or Zambia. Others stayed behind. Consequently, Dukwi refugee camp was established to house refugees. Response to the apartheid government. Paul Spray noted that the South Africa put Botswana under increasing pressure to try to force it to do 4 things: stop making anti-apartheid statements, recognize the Bantu stance, expel South African refugees, and sign a non-aggression pact. This was done largely through measures such as economically squeezing Botswana, conducting raids and targeted assassinations of political opponents. Stay tuned to the continuation of the topic on the next video. And that's it from INJIBS Network. Stay tuned to our celebrity and gossip news.